I'm Mary Doria Russell, and this is the story behind the story. People always ask writers, where do you get your ideas? All my books are different, so the story of how I came to write each one is different. The idea for The Women of the Copper Country came literally out of left field. One afternoon, I sat down at 3 to wait for a 4 o'clock ball game, and while I was waiting, I started flipping through the channels. And that's when I came across the PBS documentary called Red Metal, which is about the 1913 miners' strike in the copper country of Michigan's Upper Peninsula. Now, I've lived in the Midwest nearly all my life, but I had never heard of Calumet, or the Keweenaw, or the strike, or any of the events surrounding it. So to pass the time before the first inning, I decided to watch this documentary about copper mining. And there she was, Annie Clements, literally standing head and shoulders above the crowd, leading striking miners on daily parades through the streets of Calumet. And I thought, a miners' strike with a woman out front. How did that work? In 1913, Annie Clements was 25 years old, and she was everything a woman should not be. She was a miner's wife, but childless. At a time when women were supposed to be small and dainty, the woman everyone called Big Annie was 6 feet 3 inches tall. And then there was James McNaughton, a time and motion efficiency expert who had made Calumet and Hecla Mining Corporation the most profitable and powerful copper mining company in the world. James McNaughton ran Calumet and Hecla as a benevolent dictatorship. He was a WASP, a white Anglo-Saxon Protestant who was proud to carry what Kipling called the white man's burden, which was to rule and civilize lesser races. In 1913, he was very concerned that too many immigrants would undermine American values. This was a commonly held attitude among people of his time and class, many of whose families had immigrated to America just a generation or two earlier, an irony that was not lost on the political cartoonists of the day. Immigrant men made up most of the Calumet and Hecla workforce, and McNaughton acknowledged their hard work but did not trust them. He was very concerned that they would be susceptible to outside agitators who were attempting to organize the mine workers. And he vowed that grass would grow in the streets of Calumet before he recognized their union. As for the women of the copper country, they had no business interfering with business. They existed to keep house and raise gardens and give birth to the next generation of miners. So I'm sitting there in my living room, waiting for the ball game, watching this documentary, and my first inkling that I was being drawn in was when I thought, whoa, okay, I've got a heroine and a nemesis. That afternoon, I mentioned on Facebook that I had just watched this Red Metal and thought that there might be a story in it for me to tell. And within minutes, my friend Rivka Tobin emailed me to say that her great-grandfather, Solomon Christo, was the last man to die in the mines before the 1913 strike began. What are the odds, right? I have no connection to the UP, but I know someone whose family is closely tied to these events. And my first reaction was, I really need to take you out for breakfast tomorrow. The next morning, we met for eggs and toast, and Rivka brought me all kinds of family documentation, including the accident report of her grandfather's death on July 2nd, 1913. When I initially sat down with Rivka that morning, I was thinking that this was all going to make a pretty straightforward good girl, bad guy story. But then Rivka said, well, all I can tell you is that my grandmother always spoke the names of both Annie Clements and James McNaughton with reverence. And that was when I started to dig deeper into the story. I knew from Red Metal that a central issue of the strike was automation. Calumet and Hecla needed to cut costs in order to be able to compete with open-pit copper mines that were developing out in Arizona. As a time and motion expert, James McNaughton saw automation as the answer. Replacing a two-man drill with a new drill that could be operated by a single man would eliminate a large percentage of their underground workforce. The miners themselves considered the one-man drill far more dangerous and difficult to use. Anyone who agreed to use Elainer Ingersoll Rig got more pay, but he did so by taking away a job from his partner, his neighbor, his friend, his relative. And a majority of the workforce voted to strike. Well, it turned out that Rivka's great-grandfather, Solomon Questo, was not a union man, and that he had volunteered to use a one-man drill. When he was killed, the company wanted to send a message. If you stand up to union pressure, your family will be taken care of. As long as one of your sons is a non-union worker in the mines, your survivors will get clear title to the company house they live in. That was the deal James McNaughton offered Rivka's great-grandmother in 1913. And when would this splendid corporate generosity come to pass? In 1963, 50 years of non-union labor for a 4-room clapboard house. Now, the literary gods don't drop a story like that into a writer's lap unless it needs to be told. But this was a more complex story than I had anticipated 24 hours earlier. I was very curious about Rivka's great-grandfather. Jack Questo was the oldest son, the one who was expected to replace his father underground. He was about 15 when James McNaughton offered his mother that deal. What did Jack think about being indentured for life? Was he proud to be supporting himself and the 4 others at such a young age? Or did he resent being made responsible for his mother and 3 younger siblings? Rivka said that she remembered her Grandpa Jack as a violent, bitter, angry man. But she also had one especially puzzling memory of Jack Questo. In 1963, when she was about 14, her grandfather took her on a car trip up to Calumet. And when they got to a sandstone building called the Italian Hall, Grandpa Jack pulled over, turned off the engine, and sobbed. 20 minutes later, he started the car again and drove on. He never explained. Nobody talked about it afterwards. I walked away from that breakfast with many questions that Rivka couldn't answer. How was Jack Questo connected to the Italian Hall disaster? How did a man like James McNaughton see himself? He had virtually complete control over the lives of 30,000 people. Did he ever doubt his right to rule so many? Did he ever question his own decisions? And what makes a woman like Annie Clements? Where does she find the courage to step out beyond boundaries and get in front of a dangerous movement? Where did her strength come from? Given the timing of Solomon Questo's death, I believe that when Annie Clements heard about his accident, something snapped in her. She had recently been elected president of the Women's Auxiliary of the Western Federation of Miners, Local 15. I think she was tired of the funerals, tired of waiting for the men to lay down their tools and go on strike, tired of being told to make coffee and be quiet. I think she was fed up, and she wasn't the only one. I think all of the women of the copper country were fed up. In 1913, an average of 1 miner a week was killed, week after week, year after year. That's killed, not merely crippled and discarded like a piece of equipment that couldn't be repaired. I think the women of the copper country were tired of waiting to find out who would be widowed this week and destitute the next. So in July of 1913, Annie Clements and the Women's Auxiliary started the ball rolling for a general strike against the largest, most powerful mining company in the world. Since the novel's publication, I have been asked many times why each chapter is introduced with a quote from Romeo and Juliet. This might seem an odd choice for a story about a copper miners' strike in Upper Michigan. But think about it. 2 households, both alike in dignity. Labor and management, right? Yes, there are elements of doomed love in The Women of the Copper Country, but fundamentally, Shakespeare's play and this novel are both stories about wealth, about who produces it and how, about who gets to keep it and why. So let me draw your attention to how Shakespeare's play begins. It starts with a party, right? Juliet's father is throwing a sort of debutante ball for his daughter. The purpose of the party is to display his 13-year-old daughter to aristocrats and to attract bids for her. Juliet is a sort of asset to be capitalized on. She will be sold as her owner sees fit. And it's important to recognize that in selling Juliet off, Daddy truly believes he is doing the right thing for his family and even for this ungrateful girl child. When Juliet protests that she does not want to be married to the aristocrat her father has selected for her, he informs her that if she does not comply, she has 3 choices: beg, starve, die in the streets. I'll ne'er acknowledge thee. That, in a nutshell, was the position of James Macnaghten and brings fresh meaning to the word paternalism. Everything Macnaghten did was, in his own mind, both his right and his duty. He was correct and justified in every decision. As in Romeo and Juliet, children died, in real life and at the end of this novel. James Macnaghten never gave an inch to the employees of Calumet and Hecla, and during the strike he did whatever he could to kill the union. It took months and a private army of strikebreakers, but James Macnaghten beat Annie Clements, he beat the union, and he shrugged off the price that women and children paid for his triumph. The strike ended in 1914. Before long, newspapers went on to the next big thing, which turned out to be World War I. Annie dropped out of the headlines and moved to Chicago. She married 3 times. She was what my mother-in-law used to call a bad picker. All 3 husbands turned out to be violent drunks. But she had a daughter named Darwina, and she went out on her own and started a millinery business. She never spoke about her part in the strike, and like so many other powerhouse women of the early labor movement, she was largely forgotten. Here, for example, is Ella Bloor, who is featured in The Women of the Copper Country, and who was once quite famous. And then there is Mary Harris Jones, a name you might know because there is still a political magazine called Mother Jones. And I have to say that writing the Mother Jones chapters in The Women of the Copper Country is the most fun I have ever had as a writer. It was a privilege to write a story that honors the work and sacrifice and idealism of women who dared to change the world. I felt lucky to live in a world made by Annie Clements, Ella Bloor, Mother Jones, and so many other women activists who never became famous even for a few months a long time ago. This novel is a celebration of their legacy and a vow to carry on their work. We who are alive today face many of the same injustices that women fought over 100 years ago. Racial prejudice, hostility to immigrants, huge economic inequities. We too are grappling with questions of who creates wealth and who gets to keep it. But we can learn from the women and the men and the children who marched in the streets of a mining town in the far north of Michigan's Upper Peninsula over 100 years ago. It is our turn now to know our place in history, to stand up for what's right, the way that Annie Clements and Ella Bloor and Mother Jones and the ordinary women of the Copper Country did in 1913. Now it's our turn to carry the flag.